Good morning, and thank you for joining us today for how to run efficient, effective, and empowering meetings. Today, our presenter is Dr. Brea Heidelberg. Brea is an organizational management consultant, educator, and researcher. She's currently an associate professor and program director for the undergraduate entertainment and arts management program at Drexel University. Brea has served as vice president and chair for the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Task Force for the Association of Arts Administration Educators, and currently serves as the steering committee member for the Cultural Research Network. Brea's research and consulting work centers on diversity, equity, and inclusion throughout the leadership ecosystem. And Brea has completed specialized training in evaluation at Claremont Graduate School. She's also earned her master's degree in human resource development from Villanova University and her doctorate degree in arts administration, education, and policy from The Ohio State University. Before we jump in today, I have a few housekeeping tips for you. I want to let you know that this session is being recorded because it's a webinar. The participants in the webinar, the audience members, will not be seen in the recording. However, the panelists will be seen, and that makes this webinar available to you after this is over. If you're interested in receiving any emails about this webinar, the link to this after it's over, or any resources, please do go ahead and register in Eventbrite. You'll receive an email link to this webinar in addition to the slides that were used. This forum uses the chat box and the Q&A box a little bit differently than other forums. The Q&A box is used for content-related questions. So if you have a question you'd like to pose to Brea during this, please add that to the Q&A box. Follow that box and upvote any questions that you think you'd like to hear the answers to during the Q&A session. That helps me moderate which questions are of very high priority in case we run out of time. The chat box is used for any technical assistance questions you might have. We monitor those there. Additionally, please note that you have access to closed captioning. In the bottom right-hand corner of the black box on your screen, you will see a closed captioning button. There, you can click that button and click Show Subtitles, and that will show the closed captioning. You can change the size of them by going into Settings and clicking and dragging the slider there. You can also move the closed captioning around the screen by clicking and dragging to what suits you best. And finally, you will receive a survey after this. Please take a minute to fill that survey out. It helps us know how to do these better. But with that, I am happy to turn it over to Brea.
Hello, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen and then we will jump right in to make sure that there's plenty of time for Q&A. So we're going to talk about how to run efficient, effective, and empowering meetings today. Just a brief overview of what we're going to tackle. So we'll talk about why most of you are probably here, setting meeting agendas, meeting environments, navigating power dynamics which exist in all contexts, including meetings, ways to build consensus, having accountability, and then there will be plenty of time for questions and discussion. So one thing to think about is, why do we feel compelled to meet frequently? In some instances, it is a desire. We're social beings, so we want to check in with one another. Sometimes, there are some micromanagement elements that come into why we meet so frequently. Sometimes there are Seinfeld meetings about nothing, and people just feel comforted by having everybody in the room and taking stock of what's going on within the organization. When we feel in our personal lives or in the world, as is the case many days for most people, that you are losing control of your environments, sometimes people want to overmeet because setting a meeting and having people show up in a specific time and place is something that we can control. So there are many reasons why we feel compelled to meet frequently. I'm going to encourage you to fight that notion, and I'll tell you why. So Why are you here? Current meetings often have an uneven structure. I'm sure you've been to meetings that have been awesome, well-run, and efficient. You've also probably been to some meetings that are not. Unclear expectations. I see a lot of memes about, the purpose of today's meeting is to figure out why we're here meeting, and things of that nature. So sometimes people don't even know why they're getting together. They just know they have to get together. Bloated agendas. People have way overblown agendas. There's no way they're going to get to all of those things, but we put it on there anyway. And then we tend to have a feeling of failure or a sense of not accomplishing things whenever we don't get to them, even though it was an unreasonable expectation to begin with. Current meetings tend to be an extroverted playground. So if you are somebody that processes quickly, that is highly extroverted or comfortable navigating in extroverted environments, then that's a space of comfort maybe in some of those meetings. But it's not great if you don't, if you need some time and some space to process, or if you like to tackle things in small groups before meeting in a larger setting. And most meetings are also culturally incompetent, so they don't really account for the many different ways of living and existing and knowing and being in the world. But hopefully, after this session and you getting to practice some of these things in your own organization, you can have a clear and consistent structure so that anybody going to any meeting within your organization has some understanding of what to expect. That's a part of clear expectations with a streamlined and honest agenda. What are we actually going to discuss? What do we hope to actually tackle during our time together? And finally, you also want to create meeting structures that provide space for everyone, regardless of their background or the way that they identify, or if they have any neurodivergence. Everyone within the organization can fully contribute. So one thing to think about, and we often run into this issue, especially if you're over Zoomed, and thank you for coming today, but are there alternative methods to achieving some meeting related goals? And the one that we most often run into are meetings that could have been an email. I am a faculty member at Drexel, but at my previous institution, I once drove, it was about a 45-minute hour commute, to come up to a meeting where they just let us know that dogs, personal dogs, like people's dogs, are not allowed on campus. I don't own a dog, so that was a waste of gas. So thinking about information sharing, if that's the primary purpose of why you were getting together, is it something that could be an email? Is it something that needs to maybe exist on a bulletin board, or something that's a very small part of an additional, of a separate meeting altogether? One thing that will help you know if you need to even meet in the first place is to set the agenda. So determine what you hope to accomplish in the meeting at the onset. You can get together to learn something new. So this would be something like a workshop, skill building, information sharing. You can get together to discuss or decide something. You can also get together to make a plan of action or to actually do a thing. Now, here's the trick. You should ideally only be doing one, maybe two of these things per meeting. This means that your meeting should be shorter in many cases, especially if it's something to decide, or if you're discussing something. Imagine how much less time it would take to just do that instead of taking the time to learn, process, discuss, and decide. Once you've gotten to the 3 of those bullet points area, you're probably talking about a retreat, something that requires a longer amount of time for dedicated thought and reflection. Once you decide which 1 or 2 things of those bullets there that you would like to do or accomplish within the meeting, you need to consider a reasonable amount of time needed to do those things. A lot of people are notorious for assuming, and Outlook does this in my calendar as well, that every meeting is just going to be an hour. 9 times out of 10, you don't actually need an hour to do the thing, but psychologically, a lot of people just feel the need to stay or expand whatever it is that you're doing to fit that time. So I encourage you to think about time frames other than 60 minutes, 30 minutes, 20 minutes, 45 minutes. People tend to try to meet the time limits that are set, unless you have an habitual line crosser when it comes to timing, in which case that's probably a different issue to tackle. You might be thinking, I don't know how much time it would take to do a thing. That's fine. Gather some data. Set a couple of meetings in which you're going to learn something or discuss something or decide, and take stock of how long it takes before the conversation starts to lag or productivity has stopped. I like to help people use the imagery of, if you've ever made popcorn in a microwave, time how long it takes before you see a long span of time in between pops, right? And that's about how much time you want to give yourself for that task moving forward to see if it sticks and then becomes part of organizational culture. So in general, as a rule of thumb, it is better to meet longer about fewer things. Now, that might seem counterintuitive based on what I just said about how much time it takes to meet. But once you get good at having these types of efficient meetings, if you are taking the time to learn and discuss, and you give yourself some space to do that, not only are you helping people that need time to process, not only are you giving people time that like to maybe sit with something before they start sharing out, you're giving people the space to maybe provide different considerations for cultural norms. You're gonna get to the other pieces in a much more efficient way. So when it comes time to decide, plan, and act, you're actually going to be much better equipped to do those things quickly. So if you're thinking about what it is that people are going to do in that meeting, you have to also consider what people need and need to have access to in order to meet the goals. So if you want people to have a discussion about something, perhaps provide some readings to frame that discussion so that you're not talking about the entirety of possibilities or the entire universe of a topic. You're talking about a small subset of that universe of the topic that is directly pertinent to your organization and what it is that you would like to do. If it's time to decide, information that will help with the decision-making process. Provide people with access to previous minute meetings or notes about the project or a summary of previous conversations that have been had. This helps safeguard from running into the conversation loop of rehashing or re-asking or re-deliberating things that had happened in previous meetings. If you provide everything that has come before as a summary, then people can just go from that point and move forward. If people need to make a plan of action, provide them with the data that they need in order to make an informed decision. And previous meeting notes, as I said before, are always a great way to avoid rehaving the same conversation. Also consider when people need to have this information. So if you're having a 9:30 meeting, whenever you get to work that morning at 8:15 or 9 is not the time to send, all of these materials. It does not give people time to process. So ideally you want to give people at least 2 to 3 business days in order to process the information that you're giving them. So that also means that a Friday afternoon email send for a Monday morning meeting is not kind. Also you need to figure out who needs to be in the room where it happens, right? So who needs to be in the room in order to accomplish the goals of the meeting? Here's where meetings get overbloated and lots of voices get incorporated that may not necessarily need to be there, thus making the meeting bloated and longer than it needs to be. Just because somebody is associated with or tangentially related to a meeting topic does not mean that they need to be in the meeting. It definitely means that they probably deserve a heads up, a summary of the meeting, a quick email to say these things were decided, FYI. But if it's an FYI situation, the person probably doesn't need to be in the room. You've already gone into that when a meeting could have been an email territory. Conversely, just because someone isn't immediately connected to the meeting topic doesn't mean that they should be excluded. And this often happens with various levels of staff within an organization. Now, if you're thinking about an event, right? An event that's happening during the day, you might not be thinking about your after hours staff, but if that event happens to start at 7 or 8 a.m., maybe it's a breakfast meeting, you do need to let your after hours staff know, because they probably have things that are important to consider, or for you to know if you're entering the building earlier than normal or having an event earlier than normal, right? So whenever you're setting the agenda, give yourself a moment to think, who is going to be directly impacted by whatever's happening in the meeting, and who might have knowledge that is directly applicable or pertinent to what it is that's going to happen in the meeting. Those are the individuals that should be there. So all of the things that I'm saying right now, talking about shifting how many things you try to do in a meeting, shifting the timing of a meeting, read aheads and when you would schedule those, as well as changing who might be in a meeting, all of that is probably going to shift some elements of your organizational culture. We tend to resist change, so it's important to be mindful of that. You're going to need informational, what I call informational training wheels, in order to avoid some hurt feelings, bruised egos, and general I don't wanna-ness that sometimes comes up when you're trying to shift your meeting culture. So if you're inviting somebody to a meeting that usually isn't invited, you need to provide transparent information. You are being invited because you have knowledge directly applicable to this to what it is that we're trying to do in the meeting, and we want to hear from you. Conversely, if somebody has routinely been invited to a meeting, even though they grumble behind closed doors and complain and send each other those memes about how that meeting could have been an email, there might be some residual hurt feelings, or just some, why am I being excluded? Is there something else that I need to be worried about feels that you should be mindful of. So if it's a change in invitation the other way, your presence isn't required, because you know what, we really don't need you for this meeting, because we're thinking about things and considering things that don't really have much to do with you. Now, we are going to invite your subordinate or somebody else on staff, and we'll be sure to give you an update on what happens in the meeting moving forward. But I gift you the time back that you have on Wednesday mornings, right? So making sure that everybody is aware of the shifts that you're trying to make. When it comes to meeting preparation, so all of those things that I talked about as far as read aheads and making sure that people have actually read them, so that whenever you show up to the meeting, you can just discuss or you can just decide. That might be new for people. As was mentioned in my bio, I teach undergrads, so having people show up and not having done the reading, sort of something I'm used to. What this means is that you're going to have some accountability structures in place, so that people begin to understand that you really mean this shift. So letting people know in no uncertain terms, prior to the meeting, you need to have read this report, or you need to have looked at the financials that are attached here. You have 3 days to do it, or 2 days to do it. And if you're unable to do that, all of us in this meeting agree that perhaps you let everybody else speak first, you hold your questions to the end, or you don't get a vote this time around, right? The accountability mechanism should match up with whatever it is that you're doing in the meeting, but you do need to pick it and stick it. Otherwise, people will get the sense that they don't actually have to do whatever it is that you're asking them to do to prepare for the meeting, and the meeting culture shift will never actually come to fruition, or it'll be uneven. So some people will do it and some people won't. And then there will be a very big, like, sharks and jets fight a couple of months down the road, and who needs that? So when you're thinking about setting your meeting culture, like what actually happens in the meeting, starting with a reminder of why you're there and what are you trying to accomplish. right? This is really helpful. People are usually running from another meeting, or their brain is thinking about their grocery list and daycare pickup and all sorts of other things. So a quick moment at the top of the meeting to center the group and focus them to the purpose of that particular meeting is really helpful. Some people do a really big thing around it. I don't think it needs to be that much, because I personally, my mind will start to wander if we make a whole mindfulness session about why we're there to meet today for a 20-minute meeting. But just a quick like, hey, this meeting is to discuss this upcoming budget revision that we're going to do. At the end of this meeting, we hope to at least tackle the first 20 line items, right? Just a very quick, succinct way to encapsulate what it is that you're there for. Begin and end with the mission and the data. So this is a good way to sort of minimize the space for inequities to creep into the conversation. And what I mean by that is, if you start with a framing of the organization's mission or purpose and how it relates directly or indirectly to whatever it is that you're discussing, that's a way to focus people on that rather than personal agendas and personal thoughts and feels. Data is another way to do that. Just be mindful of the fact that data sometimes has inequalities in them as well. Note that there are different ways to interpret the mission and the data, but there should be expectations set about how to articulate those interpretations. So if somebody looks at your marketing materials or your budget line items, they might see a particular picture about what the organization is and what its goals are and what activities are defined into the organization's mission and out. And that might differ from somebody else's in the room. What you want to avoid having happen, unless you're at a retreat and the sole purpose is to have that conversation, you want to avoid people going down a rabbit hole of arguing about the finer points rather than meeting the meeting agenda. So understand that there might be some differences, but you should have some expectations set or some parameters or guidelines around what it is that you're seeing and looking at, and ways to say, my opinion differs and here's why. Once there are meeting and communication expectations, it is beholden upon those with the most power in the room to be strictest about upholding accountability measures and structures. That's who people are going to look to. And power is a relative thing within organizations. It might be hierarchical power, it might be social capital, it might just be situational power. But it's important to have everybody sort of buy into the new meeting culture, but it's really important when people do not, to hold them accountable. So, meeting environments. There are many different ways to meet. We tend to do virtual right now, best when geography or pandemics are a concern. That's the one in the center. But there are some ways to shift organizational culture regardless of which method you choose. Thinking about what it is that you hope to accomplish and the norms, the social norms that exist within your organization are going to be important for you to determine which type of meeting environment moving forward once we are able to be face-to-face and we have the choice between that and virtual again. But if you're doing face-to-face, rooms with enough space, tables and chairs for everyone to easily make eye contact and for everyone to have a seat. There is no quicker way to demonstrate a hierarchy or create problematic structures than to be in a room for a meeting where there aren't enough seats for people. And it's a very weird organizational musical chairs that tends to happen. Ideally face-to-face for most meetings, because this allows for nonverbal cues and has the least amount of additional logistical noise. So I'm thinking of specifically whenever it's time to discuss, plan, and act on something, face-to-face is probably best, although all of these can be adjusted accordingly. Virtual, as I mentioned, is where most of us are right now. Additional work is necessary to establish or shift organizational culture with this method. One thing that I do want to tell people to be mindful of when we're doing virtual meetings, we tend to want to try to graft face-to-face considerations and cultural norms into virtual settings, and that's not always best. So when people are requiring cameras to be on, that can set up inequities, especially if your organization isn't providing cameras and fabulous lighting and makeup artists and rent assistance for people, right? So there are inequities in our home lives and our internet connections. So things like requiring cameras to be on, it can be really problematic. Virtual can be great whenever it's time to learn something, right? So as you are doing right now, this is a great format whenever there doesn't necessarily need to be as much eye contact or consideration of nonverbal communication. It's also a great way to incorporate a multi-purpose agenda. So if you need to learn and discuss something and everybody's well-versed in both raise hand and chat, it can be a really effective tool. There are some additional logistical noise considerations, can everybody log on? You're on mute, can I hear or see you type things, and opportunities for inequities, as I mentioned. Phone is a fine way to meet. People, the phone's really gotten a bad rap recently. But if you have a pre-established relationship with someone and the meeting is designed to be brief and informational, so learn also includes those quick FYI sort of meetings that happen. The phone is a perfectly fine way to do that. It does let you have some personal connection. It allows you to be quick and efficient. However, it's the hardest environment to establish organizational culture shifts. So if you're doing some of the bigger items like deciding something or planning something, phone is not going to be the best. It can be very difficult to minimize logistical noise when it comes to things like telephone connections, cell towers being down, too many people being on the phone at once because there's natural disasters all the time. All of that stuff can be a really huge problem when it comes to phones. So if there's a pre-established relationship and you're doing something quick, phone is awesome. Otherwise, be a little mindful. Mixed media. So by that, I mean, some of us are going to be in the room, some of us are going to be on Zoom, or some of us are in the room, some of us are on the phone. It is the most difficult to make truly productive because half of the people or some of the people are operating off of a particular type of social norms and cultural cues and nonverbal communication, the people in the room. But people on the phone are just jumping in and it's very difficult or people on Zoom can just be jumping in. It's very difficult to navigate multiple different types of cultural norms given the different media. Logistical noise is the hardest to quell, right? So something in the room isn't working, or the person on the phone is maybe they're muted, but maybe they're gone. I don't know. Do we have quorum if that person drops off? All of that can just be a logistical nightmare. But it is important to note that if this meeting context is occurring because of inequities or lack of accommodations for individuals, that is a larger institutional equity organizational thing that should be addressed. So you want to try to minimize, once we are all back, then we are maybe all back, or if we're all on Zoom, then on Zoom. I know personally at my institution right now, we are teaching face-to-face, very far away, but all of our meetings are still via Teams or Zoom, and that's to avoid some people being on campus and some people like that mixed media issue. So be mindful of that. Navigating power dynamics. So this is usually the space where stuff falls apart in meetings, or productivity and efficiency can fall apart. Power dynamics exist in every single meeting, I promise you. And acknowledging them just at the surface can be extremely confusing for staff with less organizational power. What I mean by that is when somebody comes in the room and they're just like, oh, I understand that all the people with a lot of power are sitting together, right? And you acknowledge it, but only at the surface level, like you're not changing it, you're not really addressing it. Then staff without that same kind of power, like, okay, so are we an institution that acknowledges it? And can I speak up in these certain contexts, or should I stay quiet because we're not really addressing it? It can be very confusing. Power dynamics show up in a variety of explicit and implicit ways, as far as like, where you sit at the table, how much space can you take up, who's allowed to speak first, who looks to each other whenever it's time to talk about a certain topic. All of those things show up. And it doesn't matter if it's virtual or not. So something that you should be thinking about in your organization, because it might look a little different, is how do people demonstrate their relative power in meeting spaces, whether that's virtual or in person, and how does it look in your particular institution? So the thing to be mindful of when it comes to navigating those power dynamics is that if you're not addressing them, then they can quell conversation, and people with vital information, which usually tend to be people without the most organizational power, tend to not speak up. So you're missing out on vital data, you're missing out on important voices, and you're missing out on making sure that everybody in your organization feels like they're a part of your organization. So people at all organizational levels need to be responsible for identifying and examining power dynamics. Usually this task is given to people with the least amount of organizational power, which is quite counterintuitive. And those with power in those various contexts must first grapple with the how and the whys of those dynamics, especially when it comes to meeting culture, before inviting others to determine whether or not to keep whatever practice it is that you've unearthed. So setting these expectations is really important in meetings because it's going to impact the overall organizational culture as well. Some people's response or some organizations' response is just to flatten everything. We'll just make it flatter. But if you're not addressing the underlying issues, then everybody's still keeping track of what the organizational hierarchy was before you flattened it. And they'll just fall into line into those pre-existing norms in most cases. There are some instances where power dynamics are useful or they exist for a reason. So I'm not saying get rid of all of them. I'm just saying be mindful of the ways that they might stifle your ability to have an efficient and effective meeting. If people tend to give credence or more space to some individuals over others, and whether or not that's actually good for your organization, its decision-making processes, and how you operate. One thing that's really important to note in meetings, silence can be used in many ways. Everyone should have the right to tap into silence as necessary. So if you're going around a room for something in a meeting, saying, giving people the opportunity to say pass without judgment is important. Not everybody processes at the same speed. Not everybody is comfortable speaking up in these settings. See that power dynamics bit we just talked about. So you need to give people that space to do that. However, be mindful that silence can be weaponized as well. And what I mean by that is if somebody's taking a chance on sharing an idea or speaking up, we know that in most instances, there is some cultural norms, especially in the States, about offering some sort of acknowledgement about an idea, right? So a smile and a nod, oh, okay, I understand that, or a clarifying question about the idea or the suggestion or the thought. I've also seen people or organizations that the way that they say no to something, because they're classic avoiders and they don't like saying no because organizations want to say yes to everything, they'll just use silence instead, which is a much more morale killing way of saying no, rather than just offering an explanation and a rationale, or getting additional information about where those thoughts and ideas and plans of action came from, and then saying why you're going in another direction. If somebody's being vulnerable, a silence afterwards can often be deafening, especially if they're sharing information that is risky for them in order to provide context and data and information for your organization and its planning and decision-making processes. So be mindful of how silence is used in your meetings, and just make sure that you're doing things where your intent for how everybody should feel and operate within a meeting lines up with your actual impact. So finally, building consensus. As I mentioned before, begin with the data, begin with the information. Clearly state all of the underlying assumptions that are going into the decision-making process. Sometimes not everybody's on the same page about the underlying assumptions, or they're missing a piece of that information, and that's what holds up or stalls decision-making. Hold everyone in the room accountable for sharing, listening, and effectively communicating. If you have somebody that routinely does not pay attention, and then when you're close to ending the meeting or coming up or reaching a conclusion, they say something or ask a question that was mentioned a long time ago, you need to talk about that, right? Don't just roll your eyes and say, oh, that's how so-and-so is. So-and-so is preventing your organization from having efficient and effective meetings. It needs to be addressed. Agree to setting some foundational premises and matters before moving on, right? So even if you can't reach full consensus about something, or you can't reach a decision at that point, build your way to it so that you're not just going to have the same meeting over and over again. Okay, maybe we can't decide or take a vote on this budget right now in its entirety. Can we agree on the education department's budget? Can we agree on our overhead budget? Can we get to some progress towards getting, to approve the entire budget, right? Keep the momentum going. And understand which matters are process focused, how are we going to do the thing, and which ones are outcome focused. What do we hope to accomplish with the thing, right? Sometimes you're trying to make an outcome focused decision and all of the conversation in the meeting is about process oriented things. That doesn't line up. So make sure that everybody in the room has an understanding of what is process and what is outcome and which conversation you are having. If you'd like to have both, fine. I don't suggest it. I would say pick what outcome you want to have and then work backwards to the processes that are going to work towards that outcome. In order to reach consensus, you're going to want to have some purposeful dialogue. So polarizing debate, it's usually a tense atmosphere. There are attacks and interruptions. People are listening to respond, not listening to understand. It's not fully moderated by the person that's in the room. There might be some discomfort, especially if emotion, like heightened emotions are involved. And people will speak to factions or to groups and not to each other as individuals. All of that is a surefire way to get nowhere in a meeting and have everybody leave and feel demoralized and not have any decisions reached. Constructive dialogue creates a safety and a brave atmosphere for everyone, where people can be a little bit vulnerable and understand that, sharing information that is specific to the context or the dialogue that's being had at that particular moment is important, and that people are open and receptive to that. There are clear communication guidelines. Those are set up in advance. We talked about that with setting up meeting culture and shifting meeting culture, and adhered to universally. So the CEO doesn't come in and do something wildly different than the maintenance staff in a meeting, right? Everybody has the same communication standards. People are speaking about their experiences, I statements, and knowledge to each other as individuals, so that everybody can at least come to some understanding about where the others in the room are, even if they don't necessarily agree. So finally, accountability. Everyone should be holding themselves accountable for managing their responses to feedback in meetings. It's okay to have emotions. It's not okay to be emotional and take up all of the air in the room. So it's important to spend your energy on what matters most. If there's an incident or a moment where, things sort of break down or communication breaks down or somebody doesn't stick to the pre-established norms, your job is to work to mitigate the harm, not give further energy to those who are causing harm. So if somebody's being loud and disruptive in a meeting, or just disruptive, there's many ways to be disruptive, distracted, engaging in side conversations, that sort of thing. So make sure that you are focusing on mitigating or providing restorative action for any harm that is caused, not just focusing on those that are not holding up their end of the bargain. Finally, accountability structures must include consequences. So we mentioned that a little bit before when we were talking about if you don't do the read aheads, maybe you don't get to vote, or you should abstain. I mean, if we're thinking about in the best world or best case scenario, culture for meetings, if somebody doesn't read the materials, they would acknowledge that and say that they're going to abstain. They might offer some thoughts and some opinions if they have an informed thing to add to the conversation, but they would acknowledge and sort of self-police on whether or not they should be as actively involved as those who did do what it is that the group agreed to. But without consequences, nobody's going to do the things. Make sure that the consequences match up with, what it is that you're discussing. So somebody shouldn't necessarily be fired because they didn't get to look at the budget before the budget meeting, right? I mean, unless they've been doing it for years and it's like their primary job function, in which case, So sometimes things are going to come up. Practice makes perfect for having equitable and efficient and well-run meetings. Thinking about times when it didn't work out so great, you can develop some internal case studies. Remember that time that we were trying to decide on something and everything sort of fell apart? You can talk about those things, what you could have done differently, provide opportunities for learning based on stuff that's already happened within your organization. You can also do what I call the Chicken Little sky is falling worst case scenarios, some case studies on hypothetical scenarios. This is really helpful for those that are in leadership or management roles or that are stepping into leadership or management roles to help shift organizational culture around meetings so that people aren't caught off guard. Either way, how you're handling those, like different case scenarios or role playing or whatever, invite a broad mix of organizational folks to discuss possible tactics and solutions. Various perspectives can be very helpful. You never know where good ideas are going to come from. We tend to think about these things hierarchically sometimes. You're somebody that's made it to a supervisory position that's going to be running meetings. So you are the only ones that need to be thinking about running meetings. But from a professional development standpoint, from an equity standpoint, from a different brains are made differently and awesome things come out of unexpected places in organizational structures standpoint, it's great to have many voices in the room when you think about developing meeting culture and structure that's going to work in your organization. The last thing that I have for you today is providing closure. There is nothing worse than when a meeting runs a little bit over and you're just like, okay, bye. And that's the end of the meeting. It's important to leave some time near the end to provide closure for everybody. So what was on the agenda? Did we get to everything? If not, when will we pick this back up? What is everybody doing next? What are the next steps? What are the takeaways from the meeting? Who will be doing follow-up? Who's responsible for what so that we make sure that everybody's on the same page? Somebody might get assigned a task and then in the course of the conversation, it's realized that actually this other person would be better suited or has more time and capacity to do that task. That switch of individuals is sometimes lost because there's so much happening in a meeting. So things like who's on first for any task items that are coming up is great to sort of summarize at the end of the meeting. It's also really kind for anybody that's tasked with taking notes in a meeting setting for somebody to be running through that summary at the end so that they also have a summary, information to provide a summary as well. So that is it for my information that I'm presenting to you, and I am happy to start tackling questions.
All right, well, thank you so much for this. We have some excellent questions in the Q&A box, and I have a whole list of questions for you. You can't tell this because of the webinar format, but your quips are hilarious, and I was laughing, and it was just a joy of a presentation to watch. So thank you for that. We have some really good questions happening in the Q&A box, and so I'm going to start off with those, though I have some of my own. We have a first question about update meetings. The question says, in general, are all staff meetings where there are departmental updates, are they efficient? Are they effective? Is there a way we can make them more efficient or effective? And what's your view on update meetings in general?
So I think there is a place for update meetings. I think it's a great place for, especially if your organization is a little on the larger side, for people to get exposure to what's happening in ways that they never would otherwise, and to see the individuals that are responsible for things that they might be interested in pitching in with or helping out. They just need to be contained. Sometimes those meetings can go on and on and on, and people are providing updates about like the new stapler that they just ordered. There should be a very clear prompt about what it is that they're sharing out, and if there are any asks as a part of that share out. So in the education department, we are tackling this initiative, and this initiative. We are partnering with these schools. If anybody wants to help out and see some little kids run amok in our space, please let me know, right? Boom, that's it. And I find that those can be very efficient. If it's going to be something a little more expanded, provide the efficient piece and then say, and we'll follow up with an email. And then you can provide the Titan Graph email of information that people can dip in and out to as they would like.
That's really great. And it lends to the next question, which talks about giving opportunities for folks to share in their own work. But how do we keep folks on track for time? So the question says, you know, some people take up much more time than others and seemingly oblivious to it. And I want to keep folks on track time-wise, but not allow the power dynamic to shift in favor of those folks who dominate. I also think of the reverse. How do we, as those who are facilitating a meeting, in that having that power dynamic, not shut down a conversation because of the time clock?
Yes. So two things. One, as I mentioned before, a very specific and probably routine prompt. So it may take you some time to tweak whatever prompt it is that you do, but once you find a sweet spot for maybe the 2 or 3 things that you want people to address in their updates, stick to it, because people like that continuity, and it provides a place of comfort for people to be able to succinctly, you know, provide that information even as the information changes. You're going to couple that awesome succinct prompt with a timer. Pavlov these people, right? So it's the same timer tone. Some people do especially well with a visual timer if you're still in Zoom, so you can share your screen with a digital stopwatch so that people know how much time they have. And some people will still go over a little bit because you're going to have your habitual line crossers when it comes to timing. But, you know, have in your mind how much longer you're going to let everybody go on, and people will start to conform to the timer that you've set for them. And then eventually you can take the timer away because the organizational culture or the behavioral norm will have shifted enough so that as new people get onboarded, that'll just be what they know. So I would say both those things, a really tight prompt and a timer.
Okay, so another question we have is about taking minutes during a meeting. So do you have any guidance on how to take minutes and when it makes sense to take minutes and when it doesn't? There is a disadvantage for folks who are taking minutes or in the note-taking role because of course they can't engage and listen in the same way. But sometimes it's hard for people to opt out of taking those minutes.
Right. So when you're thinking about what it is that's going to happen in the meeting, when you're splitting up those things more purposefully and you're differentiating between a meeting that is about learning versus a meeting that's about a decision, it becomes easier to see. If we're learning something, I don't need to take minutes. Everybody that's learning the thing should be taking their own notes that are going to be their takeaway. And that's going to be different than a decision meeting where some minutes should probably be taken so that we can track the intellectual history of what it is that we're doing within the organization. Think about how your organization tends to decide things or if they're planning things, and work with everybody to come up with a template. So I'm a really big fan of essentially like Mad Libs note taking, where you've got basically an outline of things with prompts of the information that is supposed to be jotted down. So it's really easy to fill those things in, and you get a sense of what's going to be sort of expected across, you know, meetings whenever it's taking notes, so that if you are rotating, there isn't a steep learning curve for the new person that's coming in. If you've got the template, and again, I'm acknowledging that this stuff takes time to set up, but it is so worth the time on the front end for all of the efficiency that it gives you on the back end. And it also allows the person that's taking the notes to not be as much at a disadvantage because they can actually listen to the meeting for what's actually happening versus for recording purposes. If it's something where you're also dealing with different types of learners or you might have some neurodivergent individuals on staff, if you're still in a virtual space, seeing if everybody's okay with the meeting being recorded solely for the purposes of note taking, make that abundantly clear, delete it after that purpose has been served. That's another way to spread it around in a more equitable way.
That is really great. And the final question that we have in the chat, in the Q&A box, is along the line of some of the questions I have for you. What do you suggest a nonprofit do when trying to get back to in-person board meetings and there are 1 or 2 holdouts who will only participate over Zoom?
So my thoughts on that, and let me place myself in the context of who I am as an individual while I'm answering that. I have a 4-year-old who is frustrating and adorable, who cannot be vaccinated. And so I am understanding the push for back to in-person meetings, but if I don't have to be in person right now, until somebody can shoot him full of whatever it is, I'm really not that comfortable doing it. And so as a result of that, if you're trying to avoid the mixed method thing, then you're probably going to stay with the Zoom until those board members do feel comfortable. Now, having a discussion about relative comfort level and the why and the how of maybe creating some space and situations and contexts where they might feel more comfortable is another part of that conversation. So, you know, I have met with clients face to face, you know, recently, because we had a conversation about what I would need and what they would need in order to feel comfortable: masks, social distancing, you know, barriers, whatever have you. So it might be something where there maybe some space to get everybody back in the room. It's just a matter of which room and which context. But until such time, you know, I would suggest Zoom, so that everybody can be in one context.
I think that's a really great perspective, and the pandemic is such an outlier type of situation that we do have to be mindful of the fact that things won't be ideal for a while. Board members and board meetings are kind of a tricky dynamic in the nonprofit space. And so that really lends to some of the questions that I have to you about power dynamics in a meeting. So we know that the leadership of a nonprofit organization tends to plan those meetings, set the agenda for the meetings, and be a guide for those meetings, though the power be in the board members around the table. That affects multiple different things, including what kinds of goals come out of meetings, how they might be derailed, for example. And in setting the accountability that you talk about, how does a nonprofit leader sort of do that for the board that they report to?
Yeah, so that's where ideally your board executive committee will come into play, having a dialogue about things like, I see this most often come up with a consent agenda, or, you know, other things where there are expectations for read aheads, or what you're going to have happen in a meeting, and the meeting getting derailed because feelings and reasons. Having the executive committee be, you know, on board with accountability and how it's going to work is really important. Now, that said, sometimes executive committee is just comprised of the people that have been on the board the longest, that might have the highest social capital or power. So it might be an instance where you need to search for allies amongst other board members. When I've done, you know, executive coaching, when I've done coaching with individuals that work in nonprofits, it's usually going to be your newer board members, your upstarts before they get like demoralized by whatever process. That's usually where I tell them to start looking for, because those are the people that are really galvanized to create change, and might be the firmest place to land whenever it comes to those things. Having some plants among the board, and by plants, I mean people that are willing and able to hold each other accountable for whether or not somebody read the read aheads, or, you know, to be able to have different ways of navigating when somebody needs to be checked hard checked or soft checked in a board meeting, that's also helpful. So I'm talking about like really a subversive network of individuals to help start shifting those cultural norms. Usually once people on the board see that there are individuals that are willing to hold people accountable and desire to have efficient meetings, there are going to be a larger group of individuals that just sort of fall in line, and then you can start to make it a more structured, formal thing. So it doesn't always work top down, essentially.
That's good feedback about involving the board members in the conversation around efficient meetings. I think sometimes because of the nature of what it means to be a board member, busy folks who have a whole full-time job over here that they are usually facilitating, and their board responsibilities come on the second half of that, or off to the side. Are there any ways that nonprofit leaders can better support their board? You mentioned giving things to read ahead in advance. Is there a good format or a best practices around how to deliver that information? Or does it make sense to do recaps during a meeting? Is that totally bad because that then is not efficient? What is the kindest way to nurture your board into doing the stuff they're supposed to do?
So I always encourage a strong culture of consent agenda, of providing read aheads, and it should become part of the natural cycle, especially when you're onboarding people, right? So I recently joined a board, and it was awesome because they gave me the information about when board meetings are. Like it's every third Thursday or whatever. But before they told me when every board meeting was, they were like, every second Thursday, you'll get the read aheads and the materials for the consent agenda, and all of our board meetings are the third Thursday. See how they're building that already into the onboarding process and to the culture of being on the board. Here's when you're going to get the information. Here's when we expect you to have read it by. Here's what you're going to have to do action-wise as a result of that information. As long as you're providing clear markers of what's included, try to include it all in one, either in one email, or if you have an electronic space for board members. Some people have dashboards, some people use Google Docs. Whatever it is, use it and be consistent. Look at some of the best practices in knowledge management, so that you can flag things or use color coding, or whatever will work for your organization, so that people know, oh, I really need to look up the budget. I know I need to go to the Google Doc, this folder, it's going to have a green tab or a green way that it looks, so that people can also start having an idea of the lay of the land as far as the organizational paperwork goes as well. So building it into part of your organizational or meeting culture, providing clear deadlines for the information, and again, expectations too. If you can't read these materials by the day of, please let us know that you'll be abstaining from votes, right? So that you're not providing space for people to derail the conversation. I don't think that there needs to necessarily be a long recap. A short recap is fine at the top of the meeting. Hey, everybody, great to see you. Last meeting, we discussed A, B, and C. We made this decision, and now we're going to move on to these other things.
Okay, that's really helpful. And in this power dynamic space, I'd like to slip over to in organization power dynamics. So when we talk about leadership, line staff, and everything in between there, holding space for the people that are closest to the work. You talked about the concept of weaponizing silence. And I want to know, as a person who is facilitating a meeting, whether they may or may not be in a leadership position, and you see this happening in a meeting, the weaponization of silence, how does a leader intervene in that?
Yeah, so if it's something where somebody has suggested an idea and the answer is no, but people are weaponizing silence and saying no, stepping in and explaining and making sure that the person understands, saying a no and explaining why the answer is no, that's a way to step in as a facilitator. If it's something that needs more thought or more development, asking clarifying questions or saying, you know what, that sounds like an interesting idea. Why don't you set up a separate meeting with me and someone or the decision makers to fully flesh out this idea? Or you could task them with writing a proposal if it's something that's going to be worth their time. Don't waste people's time by asking them to write a proposal you're never going to read if the answer is no. But thinking about ways to just provide emotional support or professional support in those moments when people are sort of weaponizing silence can be really helpful, and can sort of shift people away from doing that. I also think larger conversations about conflict management styles within organizations, because that's just an avoidance tactic, and that just might be the organizational culture norm. But knowing that, and knowing how it might show up in problematic ways, I think is a larger conversation, because if it's showing up in a meeting, it's showing up in your programming, it's showing up in your budgeting, it's showing up other places too.
Yeah, the thing that keeps coming back for me is how much advanced prep this is for an organization. So what you've said today happens before the meeting happens, before the agenda's planned. It's about how you circulate this efficiency in your organization. And I think that can be really unnerving for some people to think about. I need to create entire organizational change to lean into a new meeting structure. But I think what you're saying here is that it's not just about efficiency, but it's about making sure that all voices are heard and all contributions are heard. So when we are inviting folks to sit at a table they're not used to being at, because this is the first time that we've ever invited certain staff positions to a meeting, how do we create safety in a room for those folks to know that their contributions are important?
So when it comes to equity, anything, I strongly encourage, if you have enough staff or enough people in a particular department to do it, the Noah's Ark rule. So 2 or more of a person, right? So don't invite just one representative from all of the staff below deck to come in, to the grand ballroom for the first time, because that can be really unnerving. Lots of information about why individuals are being invited and why their presence is something to be like celebrated and excited about, right? You're being invited here because you have expertise in this area, or you are over blah, blah, blah within the organization, and we need your insight on X, right? So that there is some building up. A buddy system, so another person on staff that is used to that meeting operating as a buddy is great, because there's going to be pieces of that meeting that are like cultural and behavioral that they're not going to know. The person that's entering the meeting is not going to know, right? So you don't want to start them off on the wrong foot by coming in the door and they're sitting in so-and-so seat, right? Or they go and get coffee, and we don't get coffee until so-and-so comes in and gets the coffee, right? All of those small things that you don't think about because you're always in that Wednesday morning meeting is something that's going to feel so out of place, and might, diminish the excitement about contributing for that person that's coming into the space for the first time. So more than one staff member, making sure that they have a buddy from somebody, like a buddy with somebody that's been in that meeting multiple times before.
Yeah, that's something I do think that the nonprofit sector does excel in, making sure the right people are at the table at the right time. And it could have something to do with the fact that our teams operate leanly. And so, there's one person doing a bunch of
one person. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that person is vital in all the conversations. So I think the social sector does that really well, about making sure that we have the right person there at the right time, making sure that person is informed about what they're supposed to be contributing to the meeting is going to be really important as well. But it is not just about, and not to diminish the conversation of equity at all, but it's not just about the person you're inviting to the meeting, calling it equity. It's about great decision making, and making sure that you have the folks that are most in touch with the work at the table of decisions that you're making about their work. So I couldn't agree more. I think you have answered every question that I have, and we have answered all the questions in our Q&A box. So I think that wraps us up for the rest of our forum today. You are going to be providing slides to this, correct?
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay, so that means that after this, please know that keep in mind to check your inboxes for the slides and a link to this forum after it's concluded. There's also going to be a link to a survey. Please do complete the survey. It helps us know how we're doing, whether the content that we've provided you is the content that you need, and it gives you an opportunity to suggest and recommend new content, things that you would like to hear about. So please do fill out that survey. And also keep an eye on your inboxes for our October 5th forum, Corporate Responsibility, a look behind the scenes with Margie Bland. And that concludes today's forum. Thank you so much, Brea.
Thanks for having me.
No problem. Take care.